to everyone who's joined us. Delighted to speak to you today and really happy to take part in Agile 2020. Bit of an experiment for all of us, one of Scott Severett's crazy ideas for a self-organizing festival. And certainly looking at the calendar, it seems to be a huge amount of updates. So we're really happy to take part in that. Our talk today is Agile as a Toolkit. It doesn't have to be a destination, and I'm delighted to have my colleague Matthew joining us. Little introduction on where we're from and who we are. So we're both from a consultancy firm called BJSS, and we pride ourselves on agile deliveries and particularly on the quality of the deliveries that we do. And I am their chief engineer for Scotland. I've been working for them for about 3 years now. And in terms of why am I talking to you today, I think I felt compelled to say something. There's an attitude in Agile that started incredibly positively. But as I move from project to project and I see different people doing it, I see a lot of the behaviors creeping in that were actually the prompt to move to something different. And our talk is really based around that, why we see it and what kind of issues that causes. And it's really aimed at people where we see them who think they're doing a really bad job, when actually in our estimation, when it comes to Agile, they're doing a wonderful job. And it's almost the image of the hipster that makes them feel bad about themselves. And we want to tell them that you're doing great. Keep it up, you're doing great. I'll now let my colleague Matthew introduce himself.
Hi, yeah, so I'm a technical architect and capability lead with BJSS. I've been with BJSS for just over a year now, and within software probably for about 20 years. Over the years, I've heard various claims about agility, and I've always thought it's much more complex than people think. I've never had the time in the moment to explain my views to people, why I might agree or disagree with the claims that they're making. So this is a really good opportunity for me to share my thoughts, and I hope it allows people to reflect on what Agile is too.
Lovely, thank you, Matthew. So a quick run through of the agenda. We're going to first talk about what we'd like you to learn. We're then going to go slightly, I think, into maybe the tongue-in-cheek territory of Agile as a religion. But ultimately, we do see this as a problem, and we want to explain why. And then we want to try and make a little bit of sense of it. And I'd say it's obviously our version of what making sense of it means. And finally, kind of wrapping it up in a conclusion of what we think good Agile looks like. So I'm going to hand over to Matthew now, who's going to talk about what we'd hope you'd all learn today.
Okay, so performing ceremonies does not make you Agile. It's not a tick box exercise. You can't pull out the tools from the Agile toolkit and then claim that you're Agile. Being Agile is not as simple as that. Making peace with the things you can't change. This is a good one. The real world is full of constraints, and some of these are really, really hard. You know, depending on your industry, if you're in banking or healthcare or something like that, you might have a massive governance. You could have products in the field which you can only update monthly. You may have an architecture that is not just built for rapid deployment. Or you could have one of those traditional specs that's landed on your desk, 600 pages, traditional spec, the system shall do this, the system shall do that. And so you have no user stories. Some of these constraints you may be able to change, some you can influence, and some you just need to accept. So slaughtering the sacred cows. There's lots of tools in the Agile toolkit, tools for business, technology, and delivery. And as you start to use these, as long as you're using them in the right place, you will start to get some value out of them. But there is a point where you can go too far. And when you go too far, you start to lose some of this value. And everything becomes too heavily standardized, and then you find that you're unable to change. And this is where slaughtering, identifying and then slaughtering your sacred cows comes in, and we'll have a bit of fun on the next slide, where I'm sure you will recognize some of these. And finally, doing is far more important than doing better. So let's not forget the value of what we want to achieve from the projects that we're working on. Um, and let's remember that the aim of the project is not about adopting agile tools, and it's not about taking a specific tool and using it to a greater extent. Yes, by all means, improve as a contribution to the value of your project, but don't bring in agile tools just for the sake of improving.
Thank you, Matthew. So Agile as a religion. We talk a little bit about where Agile started, or the motivations for it. It was really that traditional project delivery wasn't leading to a good outcome. And stripping that back to what really mattered, we'll probably all recognize on the screen here, the Agile Manifesto. And in reality, it's actually a set of principles. And it's a good set of principles. You could maybe argue about adding or removing one, but a good set of principles for me is always talking about what you trade off as a result of having something. It's not a rule. It's you have X, and as a consequence, it means you have less of Y. And I do think that the starting point for these principles is very good. In fact, I'd say almost unarguable. Probably the simplest one being having working software. One would always prefer to documentation. But in reality, it's not enough. You can't take a set of principles and start delivering a project straight off the back of them. Certainly not one that you would expect to be efficient. It's not one that you can convince anyone you should start to adopt. Very hard sell if you go to the bean counters and say, let's throw away every way we currently deliver and replace them with the 4 that are on screen here. So as a starting point, I think really solid base. And as a motivator in terms of the attitude, incredibly refreshing. But what we see today, of course, is very specific hard and fast rules have built up on top of those. And quite a lot of that is absolutely necessary. We do need to have some degree as to how we would deliver our Agile projects, and to set expectations and to give us something ultimately to improve over. But what we see, and it's as much attitude as anything, is the building up of sacred cows, the thou shalts that cannot be questioned, that we shall always do. And if you don't do them, and this is really as much about culture and attitude as anything, you are not agile. In fact, worse than that, you are to be cast down as something unclean. And that's completely against really where this started, because the attitude that we were reacting against in industry was that big upfront heavyweight, we know what we're doing, and yet still projects failed. And it feels in many ways that that attitude is coming back in as a result of having to be put more meat on the bones. Now, scrolling on your screen is, we will both admit, a slightly comedic list of thou shalts, but we'd like to maybe highlight a few of the sacred cows that we ourselves find frustrating. And the point of this is not to say that you should never do them. The point of this is really to say that sometimes they're completely pointless and you just do them because it's what you do. It is a thou shalt to your business. So we've pre-prepared a small snippet of things that are personal bugbears for us. And Matthew, I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking us through the thou shalts that really irk you.
Thank you. Thank you. So thou shalt have many items in the definition of done, and this definition of done shall be obeyed by all stories. I was having a think about this, and I thought that there's probably someone who's automated a ticket system to make sure that every item in the definition of done has actually been completed before that story or ticket can be moved to a position of done. This is my first pet peeve, and yeah, I mean, humans have a tendency to forget things. So checklists are good as a reminder to help you, but things can go too far. And a single definition of done with 20 items on it for a department of 50, 100 engineers all working on different aspects of the project starts to lose its value. And you know, we need to be thinking about where the value is and breaking this down rather than becoming too heavy. My second, thou shalt collect the requirements from the customer only, as the customer is sacred and only his will must be obeyed. Okay, it's a bit tricky, possibly a bit controversial. Yes, the customer is really, really important, but there are a couple of reasons why the customer isn't the only source, or perhaps the best source for collecting the requirements. For example, you might want to be making a revolutionary jump. I remember when the iPhone came out. Before that, Nokia was king, and if you'd have asked people with mobile phones at the day what they would think would be the most brilliant iPhone, they wouldn't have been able to come up with those requirements. It required people with imagination and innovation to be able to make that jump. And then there are other projects, and I've been involved in a few where the customer is kind of stuck with what they have. It's similar to the iPhone one, but they're working with a system. They're asked what the new system should be able to do, and they struggle not to be able to see the possibilities of a new system because they're constrained by the system and the environment they're working in. So there are better customer representatives in the business, and I think it's really important to find those and not just always be relating to what the actual customer has asked for. And I have one more for you. Thou shalt time box spikes, as uncertainty is unholy and must not pollute the sacred story point. This one really gets me. Don't get me wrong, estimation is really important for many reasons. And estimation kind of boils down to experience. Story points allow you to relate a new story to another story that you've done in the past where you have that experience of that story. But a spike is kind of where you need to tackle some uncertainty. You don't have a reference point, a similar experience. And there are some purists, agile purists, that like to time box these. But I see there's plenty of uncertainty in the project, not just on a spike. A new person may be joining the team, you may be working in it in a different part of the code base, or you may start to be using a different packaging tool or whatever it might be. So there is uncertainty everywhere. And I asked the question, well, then should we change to time boxing or time-based estimation for everything that's uncertain? I suppose the main thing that irritates me here is you end up with a mixture of metrics, some in story points, some time boxed. And this just makes life hard, really, in terms of planning, sprints, capacity planning, and just from the basic thing of being able to go through a whole bunch of stories to see whether they have actually got estimates on them or not. There you go. There's my 3 pet peeves for you, Alex. Over to you.
And I'm going to similarly mention mine. So a big one for me, a great source of frustration. Thou shalt waste a day per sprint on retrospectives, planning, and demos. Wonderful. 10% of your 2 week sprint gone up against the wall for those sacred cows. And it's not that they're not useful, but they're so rarely questioned as do we need them? And timing them can be difficult as well. How often do you find that a retrospective is scheduled in the morning of a Friday and sprint planning is Monday morning? What do we do with the half day? Why don't we move it or get rid of it? Also, why do we need a full day per sprint? I so rarely see them getting smaller. And in my view, you would think the healthy sign of an agile project is that your planning is very involved at the beginning, and it probably is a day, and that's time incredibly well spent. Sprint 12? No. And that for me, it's a sacred cow. It's something that's put in almost as an automatic schedule and is rarely ever revisited or revisited or mentioned because everybody treats it like a sacred cow. Second one for me that really irks me, Fibonacci sequences for estimations. I'd maybe phrase this as, what's wrong with the number 4? I can understand having a nice, simple convention to sort of disambiguate things is fine. But in a lot of instances, you actually find that rule is sort of quietly dropped. That's a half a pointer. And so it doesn't necessarily serve a very good purpose, but it certainly seems to become almost automatic. And nobody really follows through on the consequences of it. if I have my estimation restricted to a certain series of numbers, then that surely means it behaves a little bit more like a t-shirt. So my Fibonacci estimate of 13 is in fact slightly bigger than the one before and slightly smaller than the one above, but people don't recognize that and just add all the numbers up and say how many it is. So it's the lack of thought around it that really irks me. And then the last one, and I think this one irks me because it's such a lazy cop-out, is the self-organizing team. I think as a principle, having the freedom to decide how you work is wonderful. And when it works well, when the team are engaged in it, brilliant. But sometimes you just need to say how it's going to go. And actually, by not saying that, you're dodging the question. And it quite often comes from more senior people's in projects, I have to say, as just leaving a huge question mark for the team to solve, which isn't at all what it's supposed to be about. It's supposed to be that everybody feels valued and can find their place and can change and adopt. But for me, it's a sacred cow that's used as a cop-out in so many instances. So we've given you 3 examples each of sacred cows, and we don't want to present the view that none of these things have their place. But in so many instances, they genuinely are sacred cows and they serve no value. So now to try and make a little bit more sense out of all these things, I'm going to hand you back to Matthew, who'll talk a little about different approaches to Agile.
So here's a really, really simple problem to explore 2 forms of Agile. There's a hole in the road and the traffic is stuck. And here's our Agile man. Here he is, yep, with his spade. And he's come to the rescue. And he's been sold on the premise of being fast and responsive. We also have our Agile guru here. Yeah, here he is, the Agile guru. And he's got a set of Agile tools. He's got a lot of work to do. He needs to begin the discovery, summon the researchers, build the backlog, and do the sprint planning. But I suppose in amongst this, we have to consider that there are some legitimate questions about this hole, which make it a little bit more complex than just filling it in. How long will the repair last? How many holes can we fill a day? Do we need to put cones out? Do we need to inspect the hole to assess for subsidence? Do we need to wear yellow jackets? Document the location? I mean, the list could become endless. So we have these 2 characters. Our Agile man is practical and full of common sense, but may end up missing things. Our Agile guru, on the other hand, may be too focused on tools and lose focus on actually filling the holes. So we need to somehow strike some kind of balance in terms of what we use in order to get the value that we need.
Thank you, Matthew. And I hope we're sort of removing some of the comedic of it, because it's not to say that the sacred cows are wrong. Many of those things in the toolkit belong to the guru and they're absolutely right. And at the other extreme, light and fast can be right. Neither is correct. We want to talk a little about some of the tools in that toolkit and kind of focus on them and maybe talk about where they can be absolutely valid things to bring to an Agile project and be very useful, and maybe where they aren't, maybe where the conditions aren't right. So we have 6 that we think are probably really big pieces of everybody's Agile toolkit for very good reason. And we want to talk about where we see them as being useful, but also where they can actually be a huge distraction. So we're going to take them in turn, and my one's up first, which is behavioral driven development. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, that is ultimately defining up front what it means for a feature to work in a specific form. So describing the behavior of that feature, and quite commonly done in a given when then form. So given some scenario, when I do a thing, then there's an outcome. And it can be very, very powerful. But one thing people don't realize, and referencing the Agile Manifesto, behavioral driven development is a document, it is a tool, and it is a process. Now, in reality, that can be very powerful for all of those things. It can lead to a smoother path to development. It can lead to a smoother path when it comes to your backlog grooming and also your demos, but it can also be a massive overhead. Implementing it is not simple, and it is supposed to face two different audiences. We have the stakeholder or product owner group, they're one audience of it. And then we have the technical group themselves, and they're a secondary audience, and it's supposed to serve both. But there are plenty of instances where this can be taken too far. And if you don't bring that product owner and stakeholder audience along with you, then it's actually a huge overhead, and it's a vanity tool purely for the development team, particularly for certain types of projects where ultimately it's running a test of some kind, and a unit test would do absolutely fine. It would be the most efficient way to choose your goal. So for us, it's something that is an important part of the toolkit, but we do need to question when we bring it in and why. And in organizations where it's the default, that's because they built all their skill sets around it. That's because they've built their tooling around it, and because their product owner and stakeholder group are expecting it. But to just put it in there as a must-have part of the toolkit to be agile, it is generally wrong. It requires the right conditions for you to do it. I'll now hand over to Matthew, who's going to talk about continuous deployment.
So continuous deployment, yeah. So kind of an extension of C integration. So looking at taking code and building it, running automated tests, and deploying it onto a production environment, a QA or a production environment. So that sort of full range of automation. And there's many reasons why it's really good. Human beings are error prone. It's a fact. And I've seen some cases where there's been manual testing where it just really does not suit it. The example I think of is with chip testing, where some tools can give you hexadecimal characters to read and compare against a test script. And this is really, if human beings doing this kind of thing all day long are just going to make mistakes. So identifying these areas where not only does it improve speed, but it improves the quality and the accuracy of your testing or your deployment or whatever step it is. It's really valuable to be able to automate these and deliver something with confidence and speed and quality. So yeah, automation and doing all those automation steps between code, building, testing, and releasing all the way through to production are really good. But there is a point where you need to stop, because it's expensive and it is time consuming, and you kind of really need to understand the value that your project is trying to deliver and not get carried away. It's not worth it to try and automate everything. And actually, at some point, it will just cost you more and more to automate those final bits. Alex had a good example, which we discussed, where we were talking about being able to deploy with one click, and that's an interesting thing, but it's we need to treat it as a kind of sort of theoretical place to go to, rather than something that you practically want to be able to do, because the cost of getting to that point is too much, and yeah, neither Alex or I have ever managed to make a project do that, and the value really isn't there. Perhaps it's more important to have a few clicks.
I think it's worth explaining that one a little. It is a bold statement. The two of us worked in Agile. We work for a company that does CI/CD and has excellent platform engineers. And the bold statement would be, we've never really done continuous deployment. What do we mean by that? Well, maybe let's flip it on its head and say, what do most people think they mean by that? They mean that it is hands-off, end-to-end from a deployment perspective. That's not the same as pressing a button and doing some automation scripts. That means all of your quality gates, all the way through to your live environments, are similarly hands-off. Now, that is very, very hard. And when we look to examples in industry where it's done, like the Amundsen's of this world, you probably all read the various blog posts they do celebrating this. Fresh-faced graduate commits the code and suddenly it's live. Well, it's live in a very special way. It's shadowing the real service and checking for errors. And after a period of shadowing, then it's promoted to take a percentage of the traffic. And eventually the traffic moves over to the new version. So it is in that holistic sense that it becomes very, very expensive to do, because it isn't quite the same as automation. Because there's still a manual step somewhere, and removing that last manual step is extremely expensive, and neither of us have ever achieved it.
So on to the next one. The next one is mine, yeah, epic, story, and ready. So this is about taking requirements, breaking them down, analyzing them, and then putting some tight acceptance criteria. And this is when it's done well and done properly, it's great. It crystallizes what we're going to deliver to the business. And it allows the team to crack on with development and test activities in an effective and efficient way. So if you can do it, it's really good. But I think sometimes capturing the requirements is not a simple exercise. And this is particularly true where there's a lot of uncertainty, and some kind of data-related projects are like this. So it's important to be clear about what the business outcome is, and the value of that outcome, and how much you're willing to spend in trying to achieve that outcome. But it becomes very difficult to be able to tell you exactly what that's going to look like. So you may understand the value you want, but you don't understand, for example, in a data project, what specific data metrics you're going to use to bring that value, to achieve that outcome. And you don't know what those graphs and dashboards and everything are going to look like. But you've got a clear clear idea of what that outcome is. And I've seen teams with this get quite sort of frustrated, and they found it really difficult to be able to nail the requirements, because they're trying to get them very tight with acceptance criteria, which you can't really do. So it's important to recognize that and say, okay, right, well, at least if we got the outcome, we can provide the space for the team to be able to experiment. We need a tight and close feedback loop so that we can play back to the business what we can see, what the data is being able to show us. And then we can iterate that and get to where we need to. So it's important to recognize that you can't always take a requirement and at the beginning write a story with all the acceptance criteria that takes all the certainty out of it and builds in all the certainty so you know exactly what it is. So there is a balance. If you can do it, it's great, but you need to recognize also that there are circumstances where you need to concentrate on the outcome and allow the experimentation to deliver the goods. Sprints. Okay, so I love sprints. Sprints have got a kind of a regular heartbeat to them. They keep teams focused and they provide structure in which to operate, and the teams know where they stand. So for those that don't know sprints, we're talking about usually a 2 or 3 week cycle, where at the beginning of that, you have all your stories, hopefully your requirements, your stories that are defined to the level that you need them to be. And the team commit to those and they work through the sprint, and at the end they're delivered and you have a review and retrospective. They've got a nice heartbeat. They keep everyone focused, but there is also a downside to them and they're not always applicable. So because they are working 2 weeks, it can actually be quite difficult to react quickly. So where you've got teams that are highly reactive, platform teams, support teams, or teams that are in a bug fixing cycle, maybe on a big release, they need to be able to react quickly and get a change made. If you're working in 2 week sprints, the danger is that it can take up to 2 weeks to get your change in, and then 2 weeks from there to make the change. So you've got that, and then you've also got circumstances where there are lots of dependencies on those stories that you're working on in a sprint. And this is the case in, again, teams like platform teams where they might have a change to make to the live platform, but they need some test resource, other team, to be able to support them on that. And they may also need to go through a change request process. So either they have their story to do that work and possibly unlikely to be able to do it in a 2-week period, or they start to break up the stories into tiny little bits. And so the sprint doesn't seem to fit there. So possibly there are other ways of doing things. Maybe Kanban's an option. I thought possibly discovery phases, Kanban is maybe a better fit. Sprints possibly in the core build time are good. And then maybe they get again at the end, if you've got a big MVP, if there is a big certification process, something like that, maybe moving back to Kanban is better. But maybe there are situations where neither sprint or Kanban can be right. And so it's about figuring out what the best thing is to help you with the specific problem you're trying to solve.
Thank you, Matthew. Next time we're going to talk about roadmap. We wanted to show something that's almost business facing here, and a roadmap is that highest level planning artifact within Agile Toolkit. There are others, and it's showing you a sequence of events more or less, and it doesn't have to have any timelines against it. It can have rough timelines, and it can be very, very powerful. But there are also plenty of circumstances where it's wholly inappropriate because it doesn't give you any certainty. As an agile planning artifact, priority and maybe a rough best guess at the time of when things might happen is the right level of thing to do. But imagine where we have many dependencies and they need to meet at a certain point at a certain time, where we're looking for certainty in those instances. And to think about sort of sacred cows, there's almost a reverse sacred cow when it comes to the roadmap, which is the Gantt chart. And in many instances, it's absolutely okay to have a Gantt chart somewhere at a high level on an agile project. And for sure, it means you're probably going to have to shove in a fair amount of sandbags to give you the contingency to hit a particular date. So it's something that can be very, very powerful. It can be useful, but it does involve a lot of the business understanding what it's really telling them. It's not saying when you're going to get something. It's not even saying how big the thing is going to be. It is a planning tool that shows you the order in which things will be delivered, and it's not always appropriate in every circumstance. The final example from the toolkit we want to talk about is the story point. Now, story point for me, I think, is a wonderful thing. I think it's incredibly clever, and I think it has many side effects as a result of adopting it. So a story point is a unitless metric for somehow trying to represent the size or the complexity of a thing as if it just existed. It doesn't tell you how long it will take to deliver it. It doesn't tell you what order you would want to deliver things in, but it can be very, very powerful in producing all of those things, providing that you have all of your ducks in a row. If you are estimating things in story points, then you need quite a strong definition of done, because there is a secondary metric that's needed as a result of them, which is velocity. And velocity is, well, how many story points did I get through in some period of time? And then that idea that actually I can take a story point and I can start to turn it into something that will give me a meaning in time. And it's more complex than that, because you can't necessarily compare velocities against teams, and changes in teams structures or in personnel mean that the old velocity isn't necessarily valid for the new one. But if your definition of done isn't sufficiently strong that it is unambiguous when a thing is complete, you don't actually get that secondary metric in a reliable way. And we see plenty of projects that fall down with this. It is simple to use story points. It's relative sizing, and you can start sticking numbers on stuff. But sort of, so what is the follow-up question? Well, all of the so whats can come out of it, providing you have the conditions for them, and they require other disciplines. It also requires a product owner, or on the business side, planners who understand that metric and can really engage with it. They will fully understand that a developer might cost them £400 a day. They will fully understand that something that takes 3 days will take 3 days. But you bring this very foreign metric to them, and unless they can really grasp it and use it correctly, it's entirely a pointless metric. So for me, story point, massive believer in it. I think it's a wonderful thing when it can be done correctly, but it's not always appropriate in all scenarios because it doesn't automatically answer the types of questions that people would expect if they don't understand how to interpret it. So those are 6 examples from the toolkit, really trying to argue both sides, I guess, sort of where you might use them and why you might not. And also, if we think about Agile is about getting stuff done and delivering value, these elements may or may not work for your particular project. They vary so much by circumstance. So to try and bring all these various threads together, we want to reference back to the set of principles known as the Agile Manifesto. So if you can imagine, on the left-hand side, we have the core things that Agile prefers. We generally prefer the things on the left. And on the right-hand side, we have the things that we lose as a result of it. So if we want to do software that works, we can do more of working software if we stop writing stuff down. And it's the same with all the others. And we believe it's a very naive assumption to say that on the left is more agile and on the right is less agile. And if you were to sort of plot your project against it, being right over on that edge means that your project is extremely agile. That's absolutely not the case, because it's so much about bringing out the toolkit and thinking about why it works for you, whether it does work for you and whether you should use it, or is it just a sacred cow? So actually, good Agile could look something like this, but that picture wouldn't be enough to say whether it was or was not good Agile, because being on that spectrum isn't a marker of an Agile project. It's the thinking and the evidence in the outcome that really means that you are Agile. And we also know from plenty of projects that we work in, quite often you don't have absolute freedom to be anywhere on that scale. The most common one we come across it is around documentation itself, particularly within finance. Hefty governance steps that you need to go through before you can go live, and standards that you just can't question. And we kind of need to make our peace with those things. They're things that we can't change. They're constraints on where we can be, and we can still be agile everywhere else. We can still be agile within that box, because when we think about what a document can do for us, it can actually reduce unnecessary replication or time wasted in interacting with individuals. A document is a lovely portable thing that you can give that represents some earlier thinking that everybody's agreed on and got round. So to not only accept those constraints and make your peace with them, but start to think about how those things can actually be positive and can help other areas of your project and what aspects of the toolkit you'll bring. It's also worth saying that there's really 2 sides to the coin to any Agile project. We have a business and we have a technical team, and they really must meet and agree on wherever they are on that spectrum, because if they don't, it doesn't work. And it's definitely something that people can see as very frustrating. But it's kind of the dance. You have a partner, you have to move as one or it doesn't work. So that relationship can dictate where you can be on that spectrum. And the final thing to bear in mind is if we thought that there was some optimal, it'd be very hard to do it. But if I was to draw a line on this and say that line right there is the perfect optimal point for your project, well, things change. That's one of the big drivers for why Agile exists, is change. So that line could be moving around. And so you can be optimal 1 minute and you can be chasing it the next. So really what we're trying to say is that sometimes there are constraints imposed upon you, and how can you work with them? Or actually in reality, how can you not get too hung up on them and just accept them? And even if you do think you're absolutely nailing it and you're in the right point, does your partner in crime, that is the business, do they agree? And even if you have that condition where you both agree, you feel you're in the right place, is reality changing underneath you? And are you chasing it? So actually, what a good Agile project will look like to us is one that is almost a little bit messy and never quite right all the time, because it is changing, and that's okay. That's by design, that's okay. So to wrap up, repeating what, oh no, sorry, over to Matthew.
Yeah, so this is just kind of, this slide is sort of reflecting back to the beginning and the claims that we've heard various people make about agility, and just looking at the structure of what they look like. So the first one we've got here is we're really agile because we use some certain agile tool. So, you know, for this one, you could be using a tool really, really well, and that's really good for you. But I don't see anything in the statement that says about the value that you're adding with that tool, why it's necessary or anything like that. So using the tool by itself, however well you're doing it, doesn't necessarily say you're agile. Maybe you're not. The second one we've got here, we're agile because the sum outcome is achieved better by doing agile, by using one of the agile tools. So this one, actually, I really like this one, because this is starting to look at the value, some outcome. I've got some outcome, and I'm going to use a tool to help me with that. So I think that one is really agile. The third one we've got, we're not agile because we've got some constraint, which means we can't do agile. This is quite a popular one. But again, I think this one is good because there's a recognition that you've got a constraint. The real world is full of constraints. And not only have you recognized it, but you've decided that you can't do anything. You don't have the influence to change it, or perhaps it's going to cost too much to change it. So I think even though you've not been able to use a particular agile tool, you've recognized the constraint and the boundaries at which you're working. And so quite possibly you are agile, even though you're not using this tool. And finally, we're not agile because we don't use a certain tool. And this one, I think there's far too much focus on the fact that using particular tools from the Agile Toolkit make you agile. And that's not the case. So I think on this last one, it's more that perhaps you don't know, perhaps you don't understand really what agile is, rather than you being agile or not.
Thank you, Matthew. So to kind of wrap up, repeating really what we'd like you to learn message, but I hope it's made a little bit more sense now. Performing mechanically the sacred ceremonies doesn't make you agile. They need to have a place, and you need to have thought about them, and you need to reflect regularly on if they're still suitable for you, because the world is changing around you, the project is changing around you. To so many groups, similarly, make peace with what you can't change. In a large part, this entire talk was motivated by the number of teams we've worked with who, in our view, are doing wonderfully well at agile projects, but they beat themselves to death because of something that's not within their gift, and they're actually doing magnificently well. Sacred cows, recognize them, know they're there, and be willing to put them to death. And then finally, don't forget the real goal here is doing. Doing is the real goal. Agile may be the mechanism that enables you to do it or to do it better, but doing is so important, and there has to be a balance between getting something done or getting it done better, and getting it done better shouldn't take precedence to getting it done. So really, in summary, what we're saying is that the real heroes of Agile are mongrels. They've got a bit of hair out of place. They're slightly messy. They're not entirely confident of where they are, but that's exactly how it should be. So thank you for joining us today. I can see we have a couple of questions on the Q&A, so we'll go through those now. If anybody else has anything they'd want to ask while we're answering these, please feel free to type it up or raise your hand. So the first one we have is from Phil Wheeler. Hello, Phil. Phil really liked the sacred cows list. I have to say some of it is stolen from a site that was actually the Church of Agile. It's done in a similarly tongue-in-cheek list, but we would be happy to share that. I'm not sure how we'll share it with you, Phil, but we'll work out how to do it. So yes, can we share our sacred cows list? Yes, we will, and we'll do that with you. A more direct question comes from Kirsty, and I think, Matthew, may be worth both of us giving a view on this.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Kirsty asks, how might you tackle an underdefined story in the sprint? And would you use development time in the current sprint to help do that definition, and then perhaps plan in a defined story for later? I think it'd be, you have first bite of the cherry on that one, Matthew, and then I'll maybe give my view.
Cool. Thanks. So thanks, Kirsty, for the question as well. This comes up a lot, I think, in my experience, where you need to do a lot of work in order to get your stories defined to the right level where people can just get on with them. And you can either do this, in my view, as a kind of background activity with people squirreling away doing things, or you can bring it to the front and you can put it within the sprint and you can track it and you can discuss it during stand-ups and you can monitor its progress. If you go to the Agile, won't like you putting a task in the sprint to better define a story. But actually, I think it has a lot of value there because you can see it, you can talk about it, you can measure your progress, and you can keep it focused so that that story is then ready so that the next sprint, people can start doing development and testing on it. So in my view, yes, create a task to define that story better, put it in the sprint, and that way I think it will get more focus and more visibility than being done outside the sprint.
And I probably mirror that. I think it depends what you're trying to measure and why. If you take it out of the sprint, which I think can often work because it's sort of needless to track it, then that can work quite well. But it almost requires having something sitting above the sprint, and it's something that happens as part of grooming. And you could put your own measurable metrics around that to say, well, actually, are my stories ready in time for the sprint start? And I could maybe have a workflow around a story's definition. And that's almost doing something entirely separate to the sprint. And that can work really well if you have, say, a business analyst, an architect, and a product owner and stakeholder group who are meeting more regularly and have the time and the space to do that. And there's no particular pressure to measure that as a sort of velocity contributing activity. And the reason why I tend to favor that is because we think about velocity, it's stuff I've delivered. And I don't think that getting a story to a definition of ready necessarily is a stuff I've delivered. It's kind of leading you towards that, but it doesn't always work because it does require, as I say, that sort of something sitting above the team. Your other options are pretty much as Matthew had laid out. You can do it as a separate task, or you can do it in the sprint. But of course, the danger of doing it in the sprint is that you don't get the level of detail in time. And well, how could you size it if you've not done that work? So it's probably more sensible to have it as somehow a separate activity in the sprint that then is followed up. But there isn't necessarily a perfect answer, and it does vary by your own circumstances. I'd certainly say on many projects, I've seen one approach tried and it not working and a different one tried. I think that's a very healthy thing. Thinking of it as a sort of sacred cow, you wouldn't want to say any of those approaches are absolutely right and you should just do. It will vary by the specifics of your project. I hope that was useful to you, Kirsty. Unfortunately, this is not two-way. Okay. Oh, yes. Well, okay. Kirsty has responded. She was relatively pleased with the answer, so that's good. Any other questions from the attendees? None others have come through, so a final chance before we wrap up. No, lovely. Well, been a pleasure for both of us to talk today at the Agile 2020 Festival. Really interesting event, so I could say I've ticked that box, and we wish you all a lovely afternoon.